The scalpel moved with surgical precision through Dr. Michael Stevens' hands as he completed the final sutures on what had been a particularly challenging cardiac bypass. His movements were fluid, economical, each gesture honed by 15 years of practice and an obsessive pursuit of perfection that had defined his entire life. At 42, Stevens commanded the cardiovascular surgery department at Walter Reed Medical Center with the same exacting standards that had carried him from the son of Korean immigrants to one of the most respected military surgeons in the country. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Beautiful work, as always, Captain Derek Thompson observed from the observation deck, his voice carrying through the intercom into the operating room. Derek had been Stevens' closest friend since their residency days, a bond forged through shared ambition and late-night study sessions. Where Stevens had clawed his way up through merit and relentless determination, Derek had glided on family connections and inherited privilege, yet their friendship had endured. Stevens stepped back from the table, allowing his team to close. His surgical mask concealed what might have been a smile of satisfaction. The operation had been textbook perfect, every decision calculated, every movement precise. This was what excellence looked like, he told himself. This was why he demanded the same standards from everyone under his command. "Lieutenant Mitchell, your suturing technique still needs work," Stevens said to the young resident who had assisted him. Sarah Mitchell, barely 2 years out of medical school, had performed admirably, but Stevens had noticed a slight tremor in her hands during the most delicate portion of the procedure. "Confidence comes from preparation. I suggest you spend more time in the simulation lab." "Yes, sir." Mitchell responded, her voice carefully neutral. She had learned early in her residency that Dr. Stevens' criticism, while harsh, usually came from a place of wanting to improve her skills. Still, she couldn't help but notice that he seemed to find fault with her work more frequently than with some of the other residents. As the team began the post-operative cleanup, Nurse Patricia Williams approached Stevens with the clipboard. Patricia had been at Walter Reed for 20 years, having worked her way up from a junior nurse to one of the most senior OR staff. Her experience was invaluable, and she had a reputation for speaking her mind when patient care was at stake. "Dr. Stevens, I wanted to discuss the staffing changes for next week," Patricia said, her tone professional but direct. "We're getting some temporary personnel transfers, and I think it would be beneficial if you could brief them personally on your protocols." Stevens barely glanced up from his post-operative notes. "I'm sure you can handle the orientation, Williams. Just make sure they understand that we maintain higher standards here than they might be used to elsewhere." The dismissal in his tone was subtle but unmistakable, a pattern Patricia had noticed over the years whenever minority staff members were involved. "Sir, some of these transfers are coming from prestigious facilities. I think you might want to—" "I said you could handle it." Stevens interrupted, his voice carrying just enough edge to end the conversation. Patricia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she nodded and walked away. These small moments of dismissal had accumulated over the years, creating a tension that most of the staff felt but rarely acknowledged openly. Derek entered the OR as the team finished cleaning up, having changed out of his observation attire. "Michael, excellent surgery. That bypass was tricky, but you made it look routine." Stevens appreciated the validation from his friend, though he would never admit it. "Just maintaining standards, Derek. That's what separates good surgeons from great ones. Attention to detail, refusing to accept mediocrity." He paused, watching Lieutenant Mitchell as she carefully checked her equipment. "Sometimes I think the newer generation expects things to be handed to them. They don't understand that excellence requires sacrifice." "You sound like your father," Derek said with a chuckle. Stevens' father was a small business owner who had worked 16-hour days to build a successful electronics repair shop, constantly reminding his son that in America, success came only through being twice as good as everyone else. "My father was right. In this country, if you're willing to work hard and maintain standards, you can achieve anything. Merit speaks louder than anything else." The irony was lost on him that while he believed deeply in meritocracy, his own biases shaped how he evaluated that merit in others. Before Derek could respond, Stevens' pager buzzed urgently. The display showed an emergency code that made his pulse quicken. "Incoming trauma, multiple casualties, ETA 10 minutes." This was the kind of high-stakes emergency surgery that Stevens lived for, the moments where his skills could mean the difference between life and death. "Trauma coming in," he announced to the room. "Everyone prepare for emergency surgery, and I want this OR spotless and ready in 5 minutes." The energy in the room shifted immediately, the casual post-operative atmosphere replaced with focused urgency. Patricia Williams began coordinating the preparation with practiced efficiency. Her earlier frustration with Stevens temporarily set aside in favor of patient care. Lieutenant Mitchell double-checked the surgical instruments, her earlier nervousness replaced by the adrenaline of emergency medicine. This was why they had all chosen military medicine, the opportunity to save lives under the most challenging circumstances. As Stevens prepared for what promised to be a difficult surgery, he felt the familiar surge of confidence that came with being exactly where he belonged. In the operating room, his skills were unquestionable, his authority absolute. He was about to save a life, and that knowledge filled him with a sense of purpose that had driven him since his first day in medical school. What Stevens couldn't know was that the incoming emergency would bring more than just a wounded soldier. It would bring a reckoning that would shatter his carefully constructed world and force him to confront truths about himself that he had spent years avoiding. The next few hours would reveal whether his commitment to excellence extended beyond technical skill to the more challenging realm of human decency. Dr. Angela Roberts sat in her rental car outside Walter Reed Medical Center, reviewing the classified briefing one final time before entering what would be the most critical assessment of her career. At 49, she had achieved what few black women in military medicine had before her: appointment as Surgeon General of the United States, the highest-ranking medical officer in the military. But with that achievement came responsibilities that extended far beyond personal success. The folder in her lap contained disturbing patterns of complaints from Walter Reed, subtle but persistent reports of discriminatory treatment that had been dismissed or minimized by the chain of command, patient care disparities, unequal treatment of minority staff, and a culture that seemed to reward conformity over excellence. These weren't the dramatic incidents that made headlines, but the slow erosion of institutional integrity that could be even more damaging in the long run. Angela had proposed this covert assessment program herself after witnessing similar patterns at facilities across the country. The Pentagon had initially resisted, preferring traditional announced inspections that allowed facilities to present their best face. But Angela had argued persuasively that real change required understanding how institutions functioned when they thought no one was watching. She closed the folder and checked her appearance in the mirror. Today she would be Nurse Angela Roberts, a temporary transfer from another facility. Her dress uniform hung in the back seat, replaced by standard-issue scrubs and a temporary ID badge that identified her as a nursing assistant. The transformation was remarkable. Without rank insignia or formal credentials, she became essentially invisible to the institutional hierarchy. The irony wasn't lost on her. As Surgeon General, her every word carried weight, her presence commanded attention. But as a black woman in basic scrubs, she would likely be dismissed, overlooked, or worse. This dual perspective was exactly what made her assessment so effective. She could see how institutions truly functioned when the protective barriers of rank and authority were stripped away. Angela gathered her materials and walked toward the hospital entrance, mentally preparing for what lay ahead. She had learned early in her military career to compartmentalize the personal pain of discrimination, channeling it into a determination to change the system from within. Each slight, each dismissal, each assumption about her competence had become fuel for her mission to create a military where talent and dedication mattered more than appearance or background. Her path to this moment had been neither easy nor inevitable. Growing up in rural Georgia, the daughter of a school teacher and a postal worker, Angela had always excelled academically, but medical school at Johns Hopkins had been her first real encounter with institutional bias. Professors who questioned her presence, classmates who assumed she was there through affirmative action rather than merit, and a constant pressure to prove herself in ways that her white peers never faced. The military had offered both opportunity and additional challenges. Her medical skills were undeniable, and the structured hierarchy had provided clear paths for advancement. But she had also faced the unique intersection of racism and sexism that military culture could amplify. Early in her career, a supervising physician had routinely ignored her medical recommendations until white colleagues repeated them verbatim. During her first command position, male officers had directed questions to her subordinates rather than to her, despite her superior rank and experience. Now, as she entered Walter Reed's main lobby, Angela felt the familiar shift in how people perceived her. Reception staff barely acknowledged her presence. Security guards gave her appearance a cursory glance. She was just another temporary worker, beneath notice or concern. This invisibility would be her greatest asset in understanding how the hospital truly functioned. Colonel James Sullivan passed her in the corridor without a second glance. His attention focused on a tablet displaying what appeared to be operational reports. Sullivan had a reputation as a competent administrator, but the complaints reaching Angela's office suggested that competence in paperwork didn't always translate to leadership in human resources. She made a mental note to observe his interactions with diverse staff members. Angela made her way to the nursing station to begin her orientation, noting the hospital's physical environment as she walked. Walter Reed was undeniably impressive. State-of-the-art equipment, pristine facilities, and an obvious commitment to medical excellence. But institutional culture wasn't reflected in hardware. It lived in the countless small interactions between people, the assumptions made and respect granted or withheld. The interaction was professionally correct, but notably cold, lacking the warmth or curiosity that might greet a new colleague. "Thank you," Angela responded, maintaining the deferential tone expected of someone in her assumed position. "I'm looking forward to working with the team." Nurse Johnson had already returned to her computer. "Just follow protocols and stay out of the way during procedures. The doctors here don't like disruptions." The warning carried implications that Angela filed away for later analysis. As she reviewed her assignment, an emergency alarm began sounding throughout the hospital. The nursing station erupted into controlled activity as staff prepared for incoming trauma patients. Angela watched the coordinated response with professional appreciation. This was clearly a well-trained team that knew how to handle emergencies. "Multiple casualties incoming," someone announced over the intercom. "All available OR personnel report immediately." Angela saw her opportunity. Emergency situations revealed institutional character more clearly than routine operations. Under pressure, people's true attitudes and biases often surfaced. She had assisted in countless trauma surgeries throughout her career, and her skills would be valuable regardless of her assumed position. "Should I report to assist?" she asked Nurse Johnson. "If you think you can handle it," came the dismissive reply. "Just don't get in the way." Angela made her way toward the ORs, her heart rate increasing with anticipation. She was about to enter the domain of Dr. Michael Stevens, whose name had appeared in several of the complaints she had reviewed. According to the reports, Stevens was technically brilliant, but showed patterns of differential treatment that concerned multiple staff members. As she approached the OR, Angela mentally prepared for what might unfold. Her dual identity, Surgeon General disguised as nursing assistant, would provide a unique perspective on how institutional power dynamics played out in life and death situations. She was about to witness whether Walter Reed's commitment to excellence extended beyond technical competence to basic human dignity. The emergency alarm continued to sound as Angela entered the surgical suite, unknowingly walking toward a confrontation that would expose the deep fault lines running through military medicine and force a reckoning that would reshape careers and institutions. The trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos as Sergeant Michael Davis was wheeled through the doors of Walter Reed's emergency department. The young soldier's uniform was cut away to reveal multiple shrapnel wounds from an IED explosion during a training exercise gone wrong. At 24, Davis had survived 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan, only to be critically injured during what should have been routine preparation for his next assignment. Multiple penetrating wounds to the chest and abdomen, the paramedic reported rapidly as they transferred Davis to the surgical table. Possible pneumothorax, significant blood loss, vitals unstable and declining. Dr. Stevens entered the OR with his characteristic commanding presence, his team falling into formation around him like dancers who had rehearsed this routine countless times. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell flanked him on the right, her earlier nervousness replaced by the focused intensity that emergency surgery demanded. Nurse Patricia Williams managed the surgical instruments with the efficiency that came from 20 years of experience. "Talk to me," Stevens commanded, his hands already moving over the patient as he assessed the damage. His expertise was immediately apparent. The way he palpated for internal bleeding, checked for signs of tension pneumothorax, and prioritized the most critical interventions. This was Stevens at his best, the brilliant surgeon whose skills had saved hundreds of lives over his career. Angela Roberts entered the OR quietly, positioning herself where she could observe the proceedings while remaining available to assist if needed. Her trained eye immediately began assessing both the medical situation and the team dynamics. Stevens was clearly competent, his initial examination was thorough, and his diagnostic instincts appeared sound. "Chest tube on the left," Stevens ordered, and Mitchell moved to comply. The procedure went smoothly, relieving the pressure on Davis's lung and improving his oxygen saturation. Angela noted Stevens' teaching style with his resident, direct and demanding, but focused on patient care rather than ego. As the surgery progressed, however, Angela began to notice something concerning. Stevens had chosen to prioritize exploration of the abdominal wounds, but Davis's chest X-ray suggested a different approach might be more appropriate. The patient's breathing remained labored despite the chest tube, and his blood pressure was dropping in a pattern that suggested ongoing thoracic bleeding rather than abdominal hemorrhage. Angela moved closer to get a better view of the patient's condition. Her experience with combat trauma, both as a surgeon and as someone who had treated similar injuries in field hospitals, told her that Stevens was pursuing the wrong surgical pathway. The patient needed immediate thoracotomy to address what appeared to be a cardiac tamponade, not abdominal exploration. "Doctor," she said, quietly, approaching Stevens as he prepared to make his abdominal incision, "I'm wondering if we should consider—" "I didn't ask for input," Stevens interrupted, without looking up from his preparation. "Please maintain your position and let the surgical team work." Angela felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but her concern for the patient overrode her personal reaction. Davis's cardiac monitor was showing increasing signs of distress, and his blood pressure continued to drop despite the blood transfusion that had been started. "Sir, I have experience with similar trauma cases," she persisted, keeping her voice respectful but firm. "The patient's presenting symptoms suggest possible cardiac tamponade. His jugular veins are distended, and the blood pressure pattern indicates—" "Nurse." Stevens' voice carried a sharp edge that made several team members look up from their tasks. Lieutenant Mitchell exchanged a quick glance with Nurse Williams, both women recognizing the condescending tone that had become all too familiar in Stevens' interactions with certain staff members. Angela felt the weight of their attention, knowing that her response would be observed and judged by everyone in the room. "I understand, Doctor. I'm simply concerned about the patient's cardiac function." Stevens paused in his preparation and looked directly at Angela for the first time since she had entered the OR. What he saw was a black woman in basic scrubs, someone he didn't recognize and whose credentials he knew nothing about. His unconscious biases, carefully hidden from his own awareness, began to shape his perception of her competence and authority. "Your concern is noted," he said, with barely concealed irritation. "However, I've been performing trauma surgery for 15 years, and I think I can manage to treat this patient without advice from support staff." The dismissal was complete, but Angela couldn't let it stand. Sergeant Davis's life hung in the balance, and her medical training, earned through the same rigorous system that had produced Stevens, told her that the patient was minutes away from cardiac arrest if the actual source of bleeding wasn't addressed. "Dr. Stevens," she said, her voice carrying more authority than Stevens expected from someone in her assumed position. "This patient needs immediate pericardiocentesis or emergency thoracotomy. His symptoms are classic for cardiac tamponade, and the abdominal approach is not addressing the primary source of his hemodynamic instability." The OR fell silent, except for the increasingly urgent beeping of Davis's cardiac monitor. Stevens' face flushed with anger at what he perceived as insubordination from a nursing assistant who didn't understand her place in the surgical hierarchy. The fact that she was black and female activated unconscious biases he would have denied possessing, biases that told him she couldn't possibly have the expertise to challenge his decisions. "Security," he barked, his voice echoing through the OR. "I need this person removed from my operating room immediately. She's disrupting a critical procedure." Lieutenant Mitchell felt her stomach drop as she watched her mentor's reaction. The woman's medical observations had been accurate. Mitchell could see the signs of cardiac tamponade herself, but Stevens seemed more focused on asserting his authority than addressing the patient's condition. "Sir," Mitchell ventured quietly, "perhaps we should consider—" "Lieutenant, maintain your focus on the procedure," Stevens snapped. "I don't need medical advice from nursing staff or residents who can't recognize their limitations." The racial undertones in Stevens' dismissal weren't lost on anyone in the room. Nurse Patricia Williams had seen this pattern before, the way Stevens scrutinized minority staff more harshly, the way he dismissed their concerns more readily. But she had never seen it this blatant, this public. Angela maintained her composure even as security personnel entered the OR. "I understand you want me removed, doctor, but this patient needs immediate intervention. His cardiac output is failing." "What this patient needs," Stevens said, his voice dripping with condescension, "is to be treated by qualified medical professionals, not by someone who clearly doesn't understand the scope of her training. Perhaps wherever you transferred from had lower standards, but at Walter Reed, we maintain appropriate boundaries." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The implicit suggestion that Angela came from an inferior institution, that her competence was questionable because of her assumed background, revealed the ugly reality beneath Stevens' professional facade. "Doctor," Angela said, her voice steady despite the humiliation, "I'm simply trying to save this patient's life. The medical evidence—" "The medical evidence," Stevens interrupted, "will be interpreted by actual doctors, not by support staff who think they know better than their superiors. This is exactly the kind of attitude that creates problems in military medicine." Security officers approached Angela, clearly uncomfortable with removing someone from an active surgery but following Stevens' direct orders. The entire surgical team watched in uncomfortable silence as their colleague was escorted from the room for offering medical advice that was proving increasingly accurate with each passing moment. As Angela was removed, Davis's condition continued to worsen. His heart rate became increasingly erratic, and his blood pressure dropped to levels that made Lieutenant Mitchell genuinely fear for his life. It was only when Mitchell finally gathered the courage to suggest the same intervention Angela had recommended that Stevens reluctantly agreed to explore the pericardial space. The procedure revealed exactly what Angela had diagnosed: a significant pericardial effusion that was compressing the heart and causing the hemodynamic instability. Within minutes of relieving the pressure, Davis's vital signs began to stabilize. The surgery that followed was successful, but it had come dangerously close to disaster. As the team completed the procedure in tense silence, each member processed what they had witnessed. Stevens' technical skills had ultimately saved the patient, but his behavior toward Angela had revealed something deeply troubling about the man they had respected and followed. Nurse Williams caught Lieutenant Mitchell's eye across the table, and both women shared a moment of understanding. They had witnessed something that went beyond professional disagreement or surgical hierarchy. They had seen discrimination in its rawest form, dressed up as medical authority, but rooted in assumptions about competence based on race and perceived status. Stevens completed his work with his usual precision, but the atmosphere in the OR had fundamentally changed. His authority remained intact on paper, but the respect that had underpinned it had been damaged, perhaps irreparably. As he removed his surgical gloves and prepared to leave, he remained unaware that his career had just taken a devastating blow from which it would never recover. The surgical team dispersed in uncomfortable silence, each member processing the traumatic events that had unfolded in the OR. Dr. Stevens retreated to his office, his mind racing as he tried to construct a narrative that would justify his actions. The successful surgery gave him confidence. He had saved Sergeant Davis's life, and that was what mattered. The disruption caused by the nursing assistant was an unfortunate distraction, but maintaining surgical hierarchy was essential for patient safety. Captain Derek Thompson found Stevens in his office an hour later, closing charts with more force than necessary. Derek had heard rumors about an incident in the OR, and Stevens' agitated state confirmed that something significant had occurred. "Heard you had some excitement during the trauma surgery?" Derek said, settling into the chair across from Stevens' desk. Their friendship allowed for direct conversation, though Derek sensed he was walking into sensitive territory. Stevens looked up, his expression tight with frustration. Unbelievable. Some temporary transfer nurse thought she could diagnose better than the surgical team. Started questioning my decisions right in the middle of a critical procedure. I had to have security remove her. Derek frowned. The description didn't match what he knew about Stevens' usual tolerance for input from experienced staff. What exactly did she say? Kept insisting the patient had cardiac tamponade, wanted me to change my entire surgical approach based on her amateur assessment. These temporary staff think they can waltz in and run procedures differently than they did at whatever second-rate facility they came from. Stevens paused, the question hitting closer to home than he wanted to admit. The patient had some pericardial involvement, yes, but that doesn't justify disrupting a surgery to lecture the attending physician about basic medical procedures. Meanwhile, in the hospital cafeteria, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell sat across from Nurse Patricia Williams, both women struggling to process what they had witnessed. Mitchell had always looked up to Stevens as a mentor, and seeing his behavior toward the nursing assistant had shaken her understanding of the man she had respected. "I've never seen him like that," Mitchell said quietly, stirring her coffee without drinking it. The way he dismissed her, the things he said about her qualifications, it felt wrong. Patricia nodded grimly. It felt wrong because it was wrong. What you saw today wasn't unusual for Dr. Stevens. It was just more public than usual. What do you mean? Sarah, I've been here for 20 years. I've watched Stevens treat minority staff differently since the day he arrived. Never anything you could point to and say that's discrimination, but patterns. Black nurses get questioned more harshly. Hispanic technicians get blamed for problems more quickly. Asian residents get less mentorship and support. Patricia's voice carried the weight of years of accumulated observations. Mitchell felt sick. Why hasn't anyone reported it? To whom? Patricia's laugh was bitter. Stevens is brilliant, his surgery outcomes are excellent, and he has supporters in the administration. Complaints about his leadership style tend to disappear into bureaucratic black holes. But what happened today? What happened today was that woman was right about the diagnosis, and Stevens couldn't handle being corrected by someone he saw as beneath him. The only difference was that it happened in front of witnesses who couldn't be intimidated into silence. Across the hospital, Angela Roberts sat in a small conference room, documenting every detail of the incident while her memory remained fresh. Her hands moved steadily across her tablet, recording not just Stevens' words and actions, but the reactions of the other staff members, the patient's condition, and the broader institutional context that had enabled such behavior. The irony wasn't lost on her. As Surgeon General, she could have ended the confrontation with a single word, revealing her identity and watching Stevens' arrogance crumble into terrified apology. But that would have defeated the purpose of her assessment. She needed to see how the institution truly functioned, how discrimination played out when people thought no one was watching. Her documentation was meticulous, but it was also deeply personal. Every dismissive word from Stevens, every assumption about her competence, every attempt to undermine her medical expertise had activated memories of similar incidents throughout her career. The difference now was that she had the power to ensure consequences would follow. Colonel Sullivan passed by the conference room, noticing the temporary nurse working on what appeared to be administrative paperwork. He made a mental note to check with his staff about the new arrivals. He preferred to maintain awareness of all personnel changes in his facility. By evening, word of the OR incident had spread through informal networks among the hospital staff. Versions of the story varied, but the core elements remained consistent. Stevens had publicly humiliated a nursing assistant who had been correct about a medical diagnosis. The incident had left the surgical team shaken and raised questions about leadership that many had harbored privately for years. Stevens returned home that night confident that the disruption had been handled appropriately. He had no way of knowing that his career was already over, that the woman he had dismissed would soon reveal herself as the most powerful medical officer in the United States military, and that his moment of prejudice had been witnessed by people who would no longer remain silent. The mandatory staff meeting began like countless others. Colonel Sullivan reviewing operational metrics, discussing upcoming inspections, and addressing administrative concerns with his characteristic military efficiency. The main conference room was packed with medical staff, from senior physicians to junior residents, all attending the weekly gathering that kept Walter Reed's complex operations coordinated. Dr. Stevens sat in his usual front-row seat, his confidence restored after a night's sleep. He had convinced himself that yesterday's incident was simply an unfortunate disruption that had been handled appropriately. Several colleagues had expressed support for his maintenance of surgical hierarchy, reinforcing his belief that his actions had been justified. Lieutenant Mitchell and Nurse Williams sat together toward the back, both women still processing the events they had witnessed. The weight of Stevens' behavior pressed on their consciences, but neither was certain how to address what they had seen. Military hierarchies made challenging senior officers both difficult and potentially career-damaging. "Before we conclude," Colonel Sullivan announced, consulting his agenda, "I want to introduce our visiting administrator who has been conducting operational assessments over the past few days. She represents the Pentagon's Medical Operations Review Board and will be providing feedback on our institutional effectiveness." Stevens felt a slight curiosity about the administrative review, though he assumed it was routine bureaucratic oversight. His department's performance metrics were excellent, and he had no concerns about external evaluation of his work. "Please welcome Dr. Angela Roberts," Sullivan continued, gesturing toward the side door. The woman who entered the conference room was not the nursing assistant who had been escorted from Stevens' operating room the previous day. Dr. Angela Roberts wore the dress blue uniform of a full colonel, her chest decorated with an impressive array of military medals and medical commendations. Her bearing was unmistakably that of a senior commander, her presence commanding immediate attention and respect. Stevens felt his blood freeze as recognition hit him like a physical blow. The woman he had dismissed, humiliated, and had removed by security was not a nursing assistant at all. The implications crashed over him in waves of horror as his mind struggled to process the magnitude of his mistake. "Actually," Dr. Roberts said, her voice carrying easily through the stunned silence, "I should clarify my proper title. I am Dr. Angela Roberts, Surgeon General of the United States." The room erupted in whispers and shifting bodies as staff members absorbed the revelation. Stevens felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath him, his career and reputation crumbling in real time as the full scope of his humiliation became clear. Dr. Roberts continued with professional composure, though her words carried devastating implications. "I have been conducting covert assessments of military medical facilities to evaluate institutional culture and identify areas for improvement. My observations at Walter Reed have been particularly illuminating." She looked directly at Stevens, who had turned visibly pale and appeared to be struggling to breathe normally. Yesterday, during a critical trauma surgery, I witnessed behavior that exemplifies precisely the kind of institutional problems we are working to address. A pattern of dismissive treatment toward minority staff, assumptions about competence based on appearance rather than expertise, and a failure to prioritize patient care over personal ego. Lieutenant Mitchell felt a surge of vindication mixed with horror as she realized the magnitude of what Stevens had done. He hadn't just dismissed a nursing assistant, he had publicly humiliated the highest-ranking medical officer in the United States military. Nurse Williams experienced a complex mix of emotions. Years of subtle discrimination and dismissed concerns suddenly felt validated, but she also felt genuine sympathy for anyone facing such complete professional destruction, even someone whose behavior had been inexcusable. Stevens attempted to speak, but no words emerged. His mouth moved silently as his brain failed to formulate any response that could address the catastrophic situation he had created. The confident, commanding surgeon had been replaced by a man facing the complete annihilation of everything he had worked to achieve. "I want to be clear," Dr. Roberts continued, her tone remaining professional but firm, "that yesterday's incident was not isolated. My assessment has revealed systemic issues that require immediate institutional response. Effective immediately, a formal investigation will be conducted into discriminatory practices at this facility." Colonel Sullivan, visibly shaken by the revelation that he had missed such a significant incident in his own command, struggled to maintain his composure. "Dr. Roberts, we had no knowledge of your presence or the incident you described. This will be addressed immediately and thoroughly." The meeting concluded in chaos, with staff members dispersing in urgent whispered conversations. Stevens remained frozen in his seat, watching his world collapse around him as colleagues who had respected him hours earlier now looked at him with mixtures of shock, disappointment, and carefully concealed satisfaction. The trap had been sprung, and there would be no escape from the consequences of his unconscious bias and professional arrogance. Dr. Angela Roberts had achieved exactly what she had set out to accomplish: exposing institutional discrimination in its rawest form and ensuring that accountability would follow. Major Lisa Cooper arrived at Walter Reed Medical Center 3 days after the revelation, her JAG uniform crisped and her briefcase filled with preliminary documents that would determine Dr. Stevens' fate. At 38, Cooper had built her career on methodical investigations and an unwavering commitment to military justice. Her reputation for fairness was matched only by her thoroughness in uncovering institutional problems. Stevens waited in a sterile conference room, his legal counsel beside him, a civilian attorney his family had hired at considerable expense. The past 72 hours had been a nightmare of sleepless nights and frantic phone calls to colleagues who suddenly seemed unavailable or distant. His confident surgical persona had crumbled, replaced by a man desperately trying to salvage a career that was slipping away with each passing hour. "Dr. Stevens," Major Cooper began, her voice professional but carrying an undertone that suggested she had already formed preliminary opinions about his case. "We're here to investigate allegations of discriminatory conduct and abuse of authority. I want to be clear that this is a formal military investigation with serious potential consequences." Stevens' attorney leaned forward. "My client denies any discriminatory intent. Dr. Stevens maintains high standards for all personnel regardless of background, and his actions were purely medical in nature." Cooper consulted her notes. According to multiple witnesses, Dr. Stevens dismissed medical advice from the Surgeon General based on assumptions about her qualifications and background. The language used included references to lower standards and questioned her competence based on her perceived institutional origin.
"The context was surgical hierarchy," Stevens interjected, his voice strained. "I couldn't have known her actual rank. Any attending physician would have responded similarly to what appeared to be inappropriate input from nursing staff." Cooper's expression remained neutral, but her next question cut deep. "Dr. Stevens, I've reviewed your personnel files going back 5 years. There's a pattern here. Minority staff members receive more formal reprimands, harsher evaluations, and fewer advancement opportunities under your supervision. How do you explain this statistical discrepancy?" The question hung in the air as Stevens struggled to formulate a response that didn't acknowledge the systematic bias that his own records revealed. His attorney had warned him this moment would come, but preparation hadn't made it any easier to face. Meanwhile, Cooper was conducting parallel interviews throughout the hospital. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell sat across from her in the same conference room where Stevens had squirmed hours earlier, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she wrestled with loyalty to her mentor and her obligation to tell the truth. Lieutenant Mitchell, you witnessed the entire incident in the operating room. In your professional opinion, was the Surgeon General's medical assessment accurate? Mitchell took a deep breath. Yes, ma'am. Her diagnosis of cardiac tamponade was correct. The patient's symptoms clearly indicated pericardial effusion, and Dr. Stevens' initial approach wasn't addressing the primary problem. And how would you characterize Dr. Stevens' response to her medical input? The question forced Mitchell to confront the uncomfortable reality she had been avoiding. He dismissed her immediately, ma'am, not just her suggestions, but her competence to make them. The language he used suggested he believed she came from an inferior institution and lacked proper training. Cooper made notes as Mitchell continued. I've been Dr. Stevens' resident for 8 months. I've never seen him dismiss medical input from white colleagues the same way. When male residents or white nursing staff make suggestions, he considers them before responding. With Dr. Roberts, there was no consideration at all. Nurse Patricia Williams' interview was even damning. 20 years of observations poured out as she detailed pattern after pattern of differential treatment that she had witnessed but never formally reported. Dr. Stevens holds minority staff to different standards, Williams testified. Black nurses get questioned more aggressively about their decisions. Hispanic technicians get blamed for equipment problems that white staff members might not even be asked about. The pattern is subtle but consistent. Cooper pressed for specifics. Can you provide concrete examples? Last month, Nurse Rodriguez was written up for being 3 minutes late to a procedure. 2 weeks later, Nurse Patterson, who is white, was 15 minutes late to the same type of procedure, and Dr. Stevens said nothing. When I pointed out the inconsistency to the charge nurse, I was told that different circumstances require different responses. Dr. Robert Anderson, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, attempted damage control during his interview, but his responses revealed the institutional enabling that had allowed Stevens' behavior to continue unchecked. Dr. Stevens is technically excellent, Anderson insisted. His surgical outcomes are among the best in the system. Any interpersonal issues have been addressed through normal supervisory channels. Cooper reviewed her files. According to my records, 17 formal complaints have been filed against Dr. Stevens over the past 3 years. All were dismissed or resulted in minimal counseling. How do you explain this pattern? Anderson shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Stevens can be demanding, but that's not unusual for senior surgeons. We've always addressed any legitimate concerns through appropriate channels. Were these concerns legitimate, Dr. Anderson? The question exposed the fundamental problem, an institution that had prioritized technical competence over human decency, allowing discrimination to flourish under the guise of maintaining medical excellence. Captain Derek Thompson's interview was perhaps the most revealing of all. Stevens' closest friend struggled with the realization that his loyalty had enabled behavior he could no longer defend. I thought Michael was just demanding, Thompson admitted. I knew he could be harsh, but I assumed it was about maintaining standards. I didn't want to see the pattern because acknowledging it would have meant confronting my own complicity. Cooper gathered testimony from 17 different witnesses over 2 days, each interview building a comprehensive picture of institutional discrimination that went far beyond a single incident in an operating room. The case against Stevens was becoming overwhelming, but Cooper's investigation revealed something even more troubling, a system that had protected and enabled discriminatory behavior for years. As she compiled her preliminary findings, Cooper realized that Stevens was not just an individual problem, but a symptom of deeper institutional failures that would require comprehensive reform to address. The Surgeon General's covert assessment had exposed not just one surgeon's prejudices, but a military medical system that had lost sight of its fundamental values.
Dr. Stevens sat at the defendant's table, his dress uniform impeccable, but his face drawn with the strain of the past 2 weeks. The confident surgeon, who had once commanded operating rooms with absolute authority, now appeared diminished, his shoulders hunched as he faced the systematic dismantling of his career and reputation. This tribunal is convened to address charges of discriminatory conduct, abuse of authority, and actions prejudicial to good order and discipline, General Hayes announced. Her voice carried the authority of decades in military service and an unwavering commitment to institutional integrity. Major Cooper rose to present the prosecution's case, her evidence methodically organized and devastatingly comprehensive. The evidence will show that Dr. Stevens engaged in a pattern of discriminatory behavior that culminated in the public humiliation of the Surgeon General of the United States during a critical medical emergency. The first piece of evidence was the security footage from the operating room, which captured Stevens' dismissive treatment of Dr. Roberts in stark detail. Watching himself on the screen, Stevens winced at his own words, hearing for the first time how his bias had shaped his language and assumptions. "Note the defendant's immediate dismissal of medical input," Cooper narrated as the footage played. "Dr. Stevens shows no consideration of the validity of the Surgeon General's medical assessment, instead focusing solely on what he perceives as inappropriate hierarchy violation." The audio was particularly damning. Stevens's voice, filled with condescension and implicit bias, echoed through the hearing room as he dismissed Roberts' expertise and questioned her qualifications based solely on his assumptions about her background and position. Dr. Roberts took the stand as the prosecution's key witness, her testimony delivered with professional composure but carrying undeniable authority. Dr. Stevens' behavior represented not just a personal slight, but a fundamental failure of medical judgment that could have cost a patient his life. Stevens' attorney attempted to frame the incident as a misunderstanding rather than discrimination. "My client had no knowledge of Dr. Roberts' true identity or rank. Any attending physician would have maintained surgical hierarchy under similar circumstances." General Hayes' response was swift and cutting. "Counselor, are you suggesting that proper medical care depends on knowing a person's rank rather than evaluating their expertise? Because that argument undermines every principle of military medicine." The defense crumbled further when Lieutenant Mitchell testified about the pattern of differential treatment she had observed. Her voice shook slightly as she described watching her mentor's behavior, but her commitment to truth overcame her personal discomfort. "Dr. Stevens consistently treated minority staff members with less respect and consideration than white colleagues. The incident with Dr. Roberts was extreme, but it wasn't aberrant behavior. It was an escalation of patterns I had witnessed throughout my residency." Nurse Williams' testimony was equally devastating, providing historical context that revealed Stevens' behavior as part of a long-standing pattern rather than an isolated incident. Her 20 years of experience lent weight to observations that painted a picture of systemic discrimination enabled by institutional indifference. "I filed multiple informal complaints about Dr. Stevens' differential treatment of minority staff members. Each was dismissed or minimized by supervisors who prioritized maintaining harmony over addressing discrimination." The medical evidence was perhaps most damning of all. Expert testimony confirmed that Dr. Roberts' diagnosis had been correct and that Stevens' initial approach could have resulted in patient death if not corrected. The tribunal learned that Stevens' ego and bias had literally endangered a patient's life. Stevens' own testimony was a disaster. Under cross-examination, his attempts to justify his behavior only highlighted his lack of self-awareness and his unconscious biases. When pressed about the statistical disparities in his treatment of minority staff, he fell back on explanations that revealed the very prejudices he claimed not to possess. "I hold everyone to the same high standards," Stevens insisted, but the data contradicted his assertion at every turn.
Minority staff under his supervision received more negative evaluations, faced more disciplinary actions, and had fewer advancement opportunities. Patterns that statistical analysis showed could not be explained by performance differences. The tribunal's questions grew increasingly pointed as Stevens's defenses crumbled. General Hayes asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. Dr. Stevens, do you believe that your reaction would have been identical if a white male colleague had offered the same medical assessment under identical circumstances? The long pause before Stevens's answer revealed more than his eventual response. I believe I would have responded to anyone who disrupted my surgical procedure in the same manner. The lack of conviction in his voice made clear that even Stevens no longer believed his own defense. When Dr. Roberts was recalled for final testimony, her words carried the weight of institutional change. This case represents an opportunity for the military medical system to demonstrate that excellence and equity are not competing values, but complementary requirements for true institutional success. As the proceedings concluded, Stevens faced the complete destruction of a career built over decades. The tribunal's verdict was swift and uncompromising: removal from military service with loss of all benefits and privileges. The man who had once saved lives with surgical precision now faced a future where his prejudices had cost him everything he had worked to achieve.
General Hayes' final words rang through the hearing room. The United States military cannot and will not tolerate discrimination in any form. Dr. Stevens's behavior represents not just personal failure, but institutional failure to uphold our most fundamental values. 6 months after his discharge from the military, Michael Stevens sat in the cramped break room of a community health clinic in suburban Maryland, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The man who had once commanded Walter Reed's cardiovascular surgery department now worked as a civilian physician at a facility that served primarily low-income patients, many of them immigrants and minorities. The very populations his unconscious bias had once led him to dismiss. The fall from grace had been swift and complete. Military discharge meant loss of pension, benefits, and the prestigious career that had defined his identity since medical school. His civilian job paid a fraction of his former salary, and the professional respect he had once taken for granted was gone forever. Local medical communities were small, and word of his disgrace had spread quickly through informal networks. His apartment was a stark contrast to the spacious home he had once owned near the base. Single bedroom, basic furnishings, no awards or accolades on the walls. Just the bare necessities of a man rebuilding his life from nothing. The immigrant parents who had sacrificed everything for his success struggled to understand how their accomplished son had lost everything through his own actions. "I don't understand, Michael," his mother had said during their last painful phone conversation. "We taught you to work hard, to respect others, to be grateful for opportunities in America. How did you become someone who looks down on people like us?" The question haunted him because it forced recognition of a terrible irony. In his drive to assimilate and succeed, he had internalized the very prejudices that his own family had faced as Korean immigrants. His pursuit of acceptance in American professional culture had led him to adopt attitudes that would have dismissed his own parents as inferior or unqualified. Dr. Roberts had implemented her military medical equity program nationally, using Stevens's case as a primary example of institutional discrimination. The program's training materials included detailed analysis of his behavior, making him an infamous cautionary tale throughout military medicine. His name had become synonymous with unconscious bias and its consequences. The irony wasn't lost on him that his current patients, predominantly Black, Hispanic, and recent immigrants, trusted him with their care despite his past. They knew nothing of his disgrace, seeing only a competent physician who spoke their language of struggle and economic hardship.
Working with these populations had begun to humanize people he had once seen through the lens of stereotype and assumption. Dr. Martinez, the clinic's director, was a first-generation Mexican-American physician who had heard rumors about Stevens's background, but had chosen to give him a second chance. Their relationship was professional but distant, marked by careful observation and conditional trust. "Stevens," Dr. Martinez said, entering the break room, "I need to discuss your performance review." Stevens braced himself for criticism, but Martinez's words surprised him. "Your clinical work is excellent, and patients respond well to your care. But I sense you're still processing whatever brought you here. The medical skills are intact, but you seem to be working through something deeper." The conversation forced Stevens to confront questions he had been avoiding. Was his improved behavior simply fear of further consequences, or had he genuinely begun to change? Did he deserve redemption, or was he simply performing contrition to rebuild his career? That evening, Stevens began writing a letter he had been avoiding for months. An apology to Dr. Roberts, not the strategic lawyer-reviewed apology his attorney had suggested, but a genuine reckoning with his actions and their impact. The words came slowly, painfully, as he forced himself to acknowledge truths he had spent years avoiding. "Dr. Roberts," he wrote, "I have no excuse for my behavior toward you at Walter Reed. I dismissed your medical expertise based on assumptions rooted in racial bias that I refuse to acknowledge in myself. My actions endangered a patient's life and revealed prejudices that contradicted everything I claimed to believe about merit and fairness." He continued, describing the difficult process of recognizing how his drive for professional success had led him to adopt the very attitudes that would have dismissed his own parents as inferior or unqualified. The letter became a form of therapy, forcing him to examine the disconnect between his self-image as a merit-based professional and the reality of his discriminatory behavior. Lieutenant Mitchell, now Dr. Mitchell, after completing her residency, had written to him once, a brief note expressing hope that he would learn from his mistakes and become a better person. Her words had meant more to him than she could have known, representing forgiveness from someone whose respect he had lost through his own actions. Nurse Williams had been promoted to head of nursing at Walter Reed, her courage in speaking truth finally recognized and rewarded. Stevens followed her career progress through medical journals, feeling a complex mix of guilt and satisfaction that his downfall had contributed to her advancement. As Stevens finished his letter to Dr. Roberts, he realized that genuine change couldn't be performed or calculated. It had to be lived daily through choices that prioritized human dignity over personal advancement. His journey toward redemption would be measured not in dramatic gestures, but in thousands of small moments where he chose to see patients and colleagues as complete human beings rather than categories to be judged. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time since his disgrace, Stevens felt that he was moving toward something meaningful rather than simply away from his past failures. 18 months after his disgrace, Michael Stevens stood outside the Pentagon, clutching the letter that had changed everything. Dr. Angela Roberts had agreed to meet with him, not as part of any formal process, but as two physicians who had shared a moment that transformed both their lives in different ways. The meeting room was small and sterile, much like the one where his tribunal had taken place. When Dr. Roberts entered in her dress uniform, Stevens felt the familiar weight of shame, but also something new. Genuine respect for the woman whose expertise he had so callously dismissed. "Dr. Stevens," she said, taking a seat across from him. Her tone was professional, but not unkind. "I received your letter. Thank you for your honesty about your journey." Stevens had spent months crafting that letter, discarding dozens of drafts that felt too self-serving or insufficient. The final version had been raw and uncomfortable,
acknowledging not just his actions, but the deeper biases that had shaped them. "Dr. Roberts, I can't undo what I did to you, to Sergeant Davis, or to the countless staff members I treated unfairly over the years," Stevens said. "But I wanted you to know that your program is working, not just institutionally, but personally." Roberts studied him carefully. She had received similar apologies before, strategic attempts at reputation rehabilitation that missed the deeper point. But something in Stevens' demeanor suggested genuine change rather than performance. "Tell me about your work at the clinic," she said. Stevens described his patients. Maria, the undocumented immigrant who had delayed seeking care for a heart condition out of fear. Jerome, the young black man whose previous experiences with medical discrimination had made him distrustful of doctors. And the elderly Korean couple who reminded him painfully of his own grandparents. "They've taught me more about medicine than 15 years in academic hospitals," Stevens admitted. "Real medicine isn't just technical skill. It's seeing people as whole human beings worthy of respect and dignity." Roberts nodded. Her national equity program had documented significant improvements across military medical facilities. Walter Reed had become a model for institutional change, with Nurse Williams leading diversity initiatives, and Lieutenant Mitchell, now Dr. Mitchell, mentoring younger physicians on inclusive leadership. "Your case study has been used in training programs worldwide, not to shame you further, but to help other physicians recognize their own unconscious biases before they cause similar harm." Stevens accepted this with equanimity. His public humiliation had served a purpose larger than his personal comfort, and he had made peace with being a cautionary tale if it prevented others from repeating his mistakes. "I have a proposition," Roberts continued. "I'm expanding the equity program to include civilian healthcare systems. Your experience, both your failures and your growth, could be valuable in training other physicians." The offer was unexpected. Stevens had assumed his medical career would remain forever diminished, his contributions limited to basic clinical care. The possibility of meaningful work in addressing the very problems he had once embodied felt like an opportunity for genuine redemption. "I would be honored to contribute, if you believe my experience can help prevent others from causing the harm I caused." Robert stood to leave, then paused. "Michael, may I call you Michael? Change is possible, but it requires constant vigilance. The biases that led to your downfall don't disappear. They require daily, conscious effort to overcome." As she reached the door, Stevens called after her. "Dr. Roberts, thank you, not just for this opportunity, but for doing what you did that day. You saved Sergeant Davis's life despite my behavior. That took courage I'm not sure I would have had." Robert smiled, the first genuine warmth she had shown during their meeting. "That's what physicians do, Michael. We save lives, even when it's difficult, even when people don't make it easy for us." The story had come full circle. The surgeon whose unconscious bias had nearly cost a patient's life and definitely cost him his career now worked to ensure that other medical professionals could recognize and address their own prejudices before similar harm occurred. The institution that had protected discrimination had reformed itself into a model of equity and inclusion. Most importantly, the military medical system had demonstrated that accountability could lead to genuine progress, that confronting uncomfortable truths about bias and discrimination could strengthen rather than weaken institutional excellence. True redemption, Stevens had learned, wasn't about restoring what was lost, but about building something better from the ashes of failure. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up.
Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.